Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros, and today is going to be a solo episode. Michael's off doing some work travel, so it's just me. And I've been reading a number of Zen works lately and thinking about what Stoics can take from Zen. So I'll go through some passages from a Zen work I stumbled upon, which I thought were quite fruitful and relevant for day-to-day practice, relevant for cultivating a Stoic sense of mind, would be one way to put it. And let's dive into it. So the relevant work was written by a fellow named Gino. Apologies about the pronunciation. I believe he was Korean. His work, The Straightforward Explanation of the True Mind. And this is a 12th century Zen work. And it's translated by a fellow named Thomas Cleary. So just as an aside, Thomas Cleary is, as far as I can see, an excellent translator of Buddhist, Zen, Taoist works. I think he's translated around 80 works. He recently passed away, but must have lived an excellent life simply translating a massive amount of important works, not just from the Eastern traditions, but he also has a translation of the Quran, which I've heard a number of Muslims speak highly of. Of course, I can't directly speak to the quality of his translations. I don't have any expertise in the relevant languages, and I'm not well-versed enough to compare different translations against one another. But the mere fact that he's translated so many works and had a initial background in the academy, but was able to create a life outside of that as a translator, I think is worthy of recognition. So it sounds to me like he lived an excellent life, at least from the works he left behind. He's translated this work, The Straightforward Explanation of the True Mind, and it has several sections explaining concepts from Zen, but the specific one I want to focus on today is about practice. And there are 10 different forms of practice in this section, labeled The True Mind Stops Delusion. It's on page 252 of Classics of Buddhism and Zen, volume 3, in case you're interested in picking this up. What I'm in particular I'm interested in both of these, but in particular interested in the second one. I'll read the first one as well, just so you get a flavor of these exercises. As introductory remarks, the passage is as follows. Teachers of the past have given various different kinds of explanations of doing exercises in mindlessness. Now let us sum up the main principles in brief elucidations of 10 kinds. Number 1, alert observation. When doing the inner work, you always cut off thoughts and prevent thoughts from arising. The instant a thought arises, you immediately break through it by awareness. When errant thoughts are broken through by awakeness, following thoughts do not arise. Then you no longer need this awakening knowledge. When confusion and awakening are both forgotten, this is called mindlessness. Therefore, a master teacher said, do not fear thoughts arising. Just be wary of being slow to become aware of it. There's also a verse that says, you do not need to seek reality, just stop entertaining views and opinions. This is working on stopping illusion by alert observation. Number 2, cessation. When you work, do not think of good or bad. When the mind is aroused, stop right away. When you encounter objects, cease and desist. An ancient said, be like a piece of white silk. Be cool, be like the censer in an abandoned temple. Then you are free from vagueness and detached from false discrimination. Be like an ignoramus or a dunce, and then you will attain some accord. This is working on stopping illusion by putting the mind to rest. So those are the two passages then. Let's go over some of the concepts, some of the ideas here, then we can turn to some Stoic passages as well. So number one, we have alert observation. And it's a practice essentially of simply noticing thoughts and not being taken in by them. Not letting the mind stop, remaining alert, not letting the mind be detained. As the master's line goes, do not fear thoughts arising, just be wary of being slow to become aware of it. He also cites a verse that says, you do not need to seek reality, just stop entertaining views and opinions. That's, of course, quite similar to the Stoic thought. It's not things in themselves that harm us, but our opinions of them. And sometimes people think Zen, meditation, mindfulness, what have you, is about not thinking. And in a sense, it is about not thinking, about stopping thoughts. I think one could say that, but of course there's also the thought that being alert requires mental movement. And to say that it's about, the act of squashing every thought that arises or putting effort into not thinking, of course that just is another form of thought. So I think that's a kind of confusion one should be careful to avoid. This practice, it's about being alert. This second practice is closer, I think, to stopping thought, what we might mean when we say that phrase anyway, cessation. When you work, do not think of good or bad. When the mind is aroused, stop right away. To my ear, this practice brings up value judgments, noticing those value judgments and ceasing to make them as soon as they arise. He says, be like the censer in an abandoned temple. A censer, that's a bowl for burning incense. And he also says, be like an ignoramus or a dunce. There's also some nice connections with Greek philosophy here, of course. It's better to be in a state of ignorance, known ignorance, where you know you don't know, than it is to have an opinion that is false, vague, useless. One argument for this practice that Stoics can take away is that why is cessation useful? It's because so many of our value judgments are mistaken, vague, not useful. That's why it can be a powerful practice. Not just for a Zen practitioner, but for a Stoic. And of course, you do have to flag that the Zen goal is for attaining a kind of true mind, a kind of a Zen state that has overlap with the Stoic goal, of course, but I don't think it's the same. There is significant overlap, but I think it would be a mistake to say that the ultimate goal between a Zen practitioner and the Stoic is identical. With that in mind, there are a number of passages from the Stoics that focus on eliminating opinion, cultivating one's attention. But I wanted to focus on a longer one from Marcus Aurelius. This is Meditations 3:6. If you find anything better in human life than justice, honesty, moderation, and courage, if, to put it generally, you find anything better than the self-sufficiency of your mind, on these occasions when it ensures that your actions are compatible with right reason, as well as when something is allotted to you by fate without your having chosen it. If, I say, you're aware of anything better than this, turn to it with all your heart and enjoy the supreme good you've discovered. But if you find nothing better than the guardian spirit lodged within you, which has brought all your particular impulses under its control, which scrutinizes your thoughts, which, as Socrates used to say, has withdrawn itself from sensations, which has put itself in the God's hands, and which cares providentially for other people, if everything else turns out to be trivial and worthless by comparison, then make room for nothing else. The point is that once you've turned your attention elsewhere and turned aside from your path, it will be impossible for you to give your undivided attention in the highest honor to the good that is peculiarly your own. It's sacrilegious for what is rational and contributes to the common good to be rivaled by anything that is different in kind, such as popularity, political power, wealth, or sensual pleasure. All things that afford a brief illusion of happiness, but then suddenly overpower one and lead one astray. So, as I say, you must simply and freely choose the better course and stay with it. But what is better is what does me good. If it does you good as a rational being, don't dispense with it. But if it does you good as an animal, spurn it and keep to your original decision without preening yourself on it. Just make sure that you conduct your inquiry without coming to harm. So there's a lot here. Again, this is Meditations 3:6, the translation from Robin Waterfield, another excellent translator. And there are a number of themes from it. But if we connect it to these practices, these Zen practices of alert observation and cessation, a kind of Stoic practice comes into view where Marcus Aurelius is monitoring his thoughts, vigilantly monitoring his thoughts and insisting that their focus, his undivided attention, is on the highest honor to the good that is peculiarly his own. And that is the idea of the Stoic good. This is what he wants his undivided attention to be on. And a part of that involves rejecting anything that does not keep him on that path. So here one could apply a cessation practice for for the value judgments we make of good and bad concerning anything that is not, the ultimate good for Stoics. Doing your best, being virtuous, exemplifying justice, honesty, moderation, and courage. There are a number of levels to explain that, of course. Making excellent decisions with regard to indifference. But the typical thoughts we have do not concern, the typical value judgments we make do not concern this ultimate good, this focus, this purpose for the Stoics. And as such, one can apply the practice of cessation, simply letting those thoughts go, noticing when they arise, and stopping them. Do not be detained by thoughts that are different in kind, as Marcus Aurelius says. Anything that concerns popularity, anything that concerns mere pleasure, these sort of animal aspects of one's life. These sorts of normal, almost innocent seeming judgments one makes that on their own may make for minor mistakes, but taken as a whole detain the Stoic projects. The skilled Stoic is able to make excellent judgments, and that comes from the practice of course, reducing mistakes, ceasing to make judgments about what is good and what is bad that are mistaken. And that, of course, is quite broad. If you're thinking about, what are some examples here? Well, these are decisions you make because something feels good, because it is popular, because you want to avoid pain, because you want to avoid the rejection of a social group, instead of simply making excellent decisions. And these sorts of mental movements, if you just think about, pursuing pleasure, avoiding pain, can be quite subtle. So if you're able to sort of set, I think it's an interesting practice is to set a challenge of noticing those movements towards pleasure for its own sake, pain, avoiding pain for its own sake, and perhaps trying to resist those, instead thinking rationally through what one ought to do. So I think this idea is you get a simple practice. Ruthlessly monitor your thoughts and dissolve any false or ignorant opinions, thoughts that don't represent reality and do not amount to knowledge. And I think the point isn't just to reframe these thoughts, although that is a useful Stoic practice. I'm feeling anxious. That's because I have some value judgment about some possible future event being bad for me. I could reframe these thoughts and bring to mind, the possibility that, perhaps things will turn out well for me, or reframe nervousness into excitement or something of that sort. That's not the point. The point isn't even to convince yourself that a given opinion is false. With philosophy and dialectic, you have some urge to waste time because doing so would be pleasurable. The advice isn't to reason with yourself about, your judgment that I ought to waste time because it would feel good, versus your vision of a good life involves more than merely feeling good. You can have a sort of internal debate, kick off an internal debate that can be useful, and perhaps some sort of Socratic questioning, cultivating an inner discourse. But the point of this practice isn't to do that. It's just to simply stop. Notice that you've made a judgment. Notice that your thought was mere opinion, and then return to the matter at hand. Perhaps, I said earlier, ruthlessly monitor your thoughts, but perhaps you could also think of this as, in a more Zen fashion, perhaps, of effortlessly cultivating a kind of effortless awareness you might speak of, or a gentle monitoring that's simply ready to cease any false opinions that arise. And we can break this down more with some ideas from Stoic psychology. We have the initial impression, any sensation, then we reflect on it, then we decide to agree to it. So here we have, if I'm thinking about the earlier example, while working, I notice a temptation to waste time. That sensation can take a number of different forms. Maybe it has some physical properties, mental properties. There's some image associated with it. This sort of bare stuff that makes up consciousness, that impression, that sense that can come together into a judgment. I want, and then becomes I want to waste time. Or it might not be framed in that way, but I deserve to take a break, or this opportunity would be more fun, and I like to do things that are fun instead of whatever I set my mind to earlier in the day. So that impression becomes a full-blown judgment. We reflect on it and then assent to it. This process, very fast, of course, a very fast process. Through impression, reflection, assent, which eventually becomes desire, motive for action. Often our language, even just as I spoke about this process, blurs these steps together, especially when it comes to judgments about things so simple as pleasure and pain. And I think that's where these practices of cultivating attention, noticing opinions, can be so useful in breaking down some of the finer aspects of our experience. At least that's how I find them, and that's perhaps why I've been drawn to some of the Zen works recently, is different ways of describing conscious experience. And even though they're not as focused on the ideas of reason as the Stoics, I think Stoics can certainly take away a lot from how they speak about mental movements, attention, these ideas of mindlessness, preferring ignorance over illusion. So again, to boil this down into a simple Stoic practice, if you will, the idea is to be vigilant, be attentive with respect to your thoughts, and dissolve any false or ignorant ones. Keep that as a focus of the day and see how it works for you. Bye all. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. If you found this conversation useful, please give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you use, and share it with a friend. And I'd like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. Do check out his work at ancientlyre.com, and please get in touch with us at stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback or questions. Until next time.